Dan the man Schneider. Dan the biter Schneider. Dan the spider Schneider. Dan the defiler Schneider. Dan the initiator Schneider. Down south Dan Schneider. Dan the plunger Schneider. Dan the bladder Schneider. Dan the seducer Schneider. Dan teen bedder Schneider. Dan rough rider Schneider. Dan the collector Schneider. No lube required Schneider. Dan the despoiler Schneider. Dan deep pounder Schneider. Dan get in the van Schneider. Dan cuny hoarder Schneider. Dan I've had tighter Schneider. Dan the fart inhaler Schneider. Dan deep inside her Schneider. Dan the overnighter Schneider. Dan cam inside her Schneider. Please mister, slower Schneider. Dan the rough rider Schneider. Dan the meat grinder Schneider. Dan the diaper slider Schneider. Dan like some tighter Schneider. Dan the cheek divider Schneider. Dan the virginity taker Schneider. Dan the hymen divider Schneider. Dan the cervix wrecker Schneider. Dan this one's a bleeder Schneider. Dan the demolition man Schneider. Dan the pussy annihilator Schneider. Dan the starlet sodomizer Schneider. Dan the junior high insider Schneider. Dan already creamped Schneider. Dan I like 'em small and tan Schneider. Dan goes wild with your child Schneider. Dan that ass could be redder Schneider. Dan but I poop from there Mr. Schneider. Dan wham bam thank you ma'am Schneider. Dan we got ourselves a screamer Schneider. Dan say goodbye to your brown eye Schneider. Dan gimme that cuny if you want the money Schneider. Dan the man with the plan to get kids in his van Schneider. Ass man Dan. Danny daycare. Spread 'em Dan. Candyman Dan. Family man Dan. Big Daddy Dan. Deep Throat Dan. The Big Dicked Nick. Dirty Dan Schneider. Schneider the Butcher. Bend over Schneider. Foot Soldier Schneider. Dan make it wider Schneider. Dan slide it inside her Schneider. Dan you'll never find her Schneider. Dan the young slit divider Schneider. Dan all 3 inches inside her Schneider. Dan get gnarly with a Carly Schneider. Dan put a finger inside her Schneider. Dan try some of this cider Schneider. Danny diapers. Dan all-nighter Schneider. Dan squeal and no deal Schneider. Dan hold her tighter, she's a fighter Schneider. Dan first I tape them, then I rape them Schneider. Dan if you have a daughter you better hide her Schneider. Dirty Dan that sure as hell ain't got a pinhead Larry Schneider. Dan if your age is on the clock then it's time for cock Schneider. Dan if there's grass on the field then she better yield Schneider. Dan if they're young and firm I make them squirm Schneider. Dan wanna be a star? Get in the car Schneider. Dan the man with a plan and an unmarked white van Schneider. Dan I pork what I can Schneider. Dan old enough to read, old enough to breed Schneider. Dan can Dylan Schneider. Dan splitter in twain Schneider. Dan 12-inch span Schneider. Dan baby loven clan Schneider. Dan ladies man, Schneider. Dan use your hand, Schneider. Dan vaginal scan, Schneider. Dan wider than, Schneider. Dan game plan, Schneider. Dan panties in the trash can, Schneider. Dan chicks on my catamaran, Schneider. Dan teen breeder, Schneider. Dan aisle defiler, Schneider. Dan leg divider, Schneider. Dan open wider, Schneider. Dan condom hider, Schneider. Dan cum provider, Schneider. Dan gangbang guider, Schneider. Dan super collider, Schneider. Dan minor 69er, Schneider. Dan whole hand inside her, Schneider. Dan the rump rider, Schneider. Dan stick it inside her, Schneider. Dan the warmth provider, Schneider. Dan if her age is on the clock, she's old enough for cock, Schneider. Dan fuck her in the ass then take her to math class, Schneider. Dan the man with a plan to get underage poontang. Dan if you take the dick you get the flick, Schneider. Dan go ahead and hide her, my dick spin inside her, Schneider. Dan hop in the SUV and get on those knees, Schneider. Dan I like him shorter, Schneider. Dan I like my child actress with my dick in her, Schneider. Dan I want to beat my meat on your feet, Schneider. Dan I've got the right role if you've got a tight hole, Schneider. Dan if she's underage, gotta slime her, Schneider. Dan if you want a show, let me lick your toes, Schneider. Dan if your hand can fit in a Pringles can, get ready to take my dingle, some pie, Schneider. Dan ignore her cries as innocence dies, Schneider. Dan it's not wrong if we do it over a song, Schneider. Dan jacking off 2 feet if they're innocent and sweet, Schneider. Dan Jamie Lynn speared, Schneider. Dan just the tip so spread the lip, Schneider. Dan let me ride her, Schneider. Dan Lee single hotel shawty's first pool party, Schneider. Dan lick her feet and bite her, Schneider. Dan living the /B/tar dream, Schneider. Dan let me put in the rear or no more career, Schneider. Dan hide the kid, here comes the yid, Schneider. Dan I fuck kids in the butt, that's why Cupid got cut after eyes wide shut, Schneider. Dan can profile this pedophile, Schneider. Dan not even the FBI can touch this guy, Schneider. Dan the man who pulled the strings behind the pedo rings, Schneider. Dan my dick is bold, he fits an 8 years old, Schneider. Dan the man in the rape van, Schneider. Dan this 6 yo bitches will need stitches to take a shit, Schneider.